March 15, 1978. Grauman's Chinese Theater. A drunk fan shouted across the red carpet, "Hey Duke, your daddy died like a coward in that mine shaft." 300 reporters, dozens of cameras, every eye on John Wayne. Wayne stopped walking, turned slowly, looked straight at the heckler. "Son," Wayne said, his voice carrying that familiar drawl, "a man's got to know when to speak and when to listen. Tonight you might want to try the second one." The crowd laughed. The cameras rolled. Everyone called it Classic Duke. Calm, controlled, unshakable. But Frank Morrison, standing 10 feet away, saw what nobody else did. He saw Wayne's hands trembling, saw the color drain from the legend's face, saw a man who just heard his deepest secret screamed in public, because Frank knew the truth about that mine shaft, and apparently so did someone else. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Frank's security badge felt heavy against his chest as Wayne's entourage swept past him into the theater lobby. The Duke's shoulders were rigid beneath his custom tuxedo, but he kept that trademark swagger, nodding to well-wishers as camera flashes exploded around them. Frank had seen Wayne handle hostile crowds before, drunken cowboys in Durango, anti-war protesters in Berkeley. But this was different. The tremor in Wayne's hands hadn't stopped. The premiere of The Shootist was supposed to be a celebration. Wayne's comeback after beating cancer, Hollywood royalty turning out to honor the aging giant. Frank scanned the crowd with practiced eyes, noting exits, counting security personnel, watching for trouble. After 15 years protecting studio assets, he could spot a threat 3 conversations away. But he hadn't seen this one coming. The heckler was gone now, melted back into the crowd outside. Frank pushed through the lobby, following Wayne's group toward the theater entrance. Ava Gardner laughed at something Jimmy Stewart whispered. Lauren Bacall posed for photographs. The machine of Hollywood glamour ground on, but Frank couldn't shake what he'd witnessed on that red carpet. Wayne paused at the theater doors, his publicist whispering in his ear. For a moment, the Duke's mask slipped completely. Frank saw genuine fear flicker across those weathered features, the same expression he'd worn 3 years ago when the doctors told him about the cancer. Raw, vulnerable, mortal. Their eyes met across the crowded lobby. Wayne's gaze held Frank's for 3 seconds that felt like hours. In that moment, Frank understood he wasn't the only one who'd recognized the significance of the heckler's words. Someone had sent a message tonight, and Wayne knew it. The publicist guided Wayne into the theater, and the moment broke. Frank stood alone in the lobby, adrenaline coursing through his system. Around him, the last stragglers filed into their seats. Ushers dimmed the lights. The ordinary world of Hollywood premieres reasserted itself. But Frank's world had just shifted off its axis. He'd been there that night in 1949, when Wayne came stumbling into the Republic Pictures lot at 2 a.m., drunk and rambling about his father's death. Frank was just a junior security guard then, barely 25, working graveyard shifts to pay for community college. He'd found Wayne sitting in his Cadillac in the empty parking lot, staring at a telegram from Winterset, Iowa. "They're saying it was an accident," Wayne had mumbled, his famous voice slurred with bourbon. "Cave in at the Morrison mine. Poor Clyde Morrison, crushed under a ton of rock trying to make an honest dollar." Frank had listened because it was his job to listen. Studio security meant protecting more than just property. It meant protecting secrets, reputations, the carefully constructed mythologies that sold movie tickets. "But I know better," Wayne had continued. "Clyde Morrison didn't die in any cave-in. He was murdered, son. Murdered because he found something in that mine he wasn't supposed to find." Frank had filed the incident as a grief reaction, alcohol and loss making a man see conspiracies where none existed. Wayne never mentioned it again, and Frank convinced himself it had been the bourbon talking, until tonight. Standing in that empty lobby, Frank replayed the heckler's exact words. "Your daddy died like a coward in that mine shaft." Not mining accident, not cave-in, mine shaft. The same detail Wayne had obsessed over that night in 1949, the fact that his father's body had been found in an abandoned shaft, not the working mine where he was supposedly employed. The theater doors opened and a studio executive emerged, scanning the lobby until he spotted Frank. "Morrison, Wayne wants to see you," private meeting after the screening. Frank nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. In 15 years of studio security, he'd never been summoned to a private audience with John Wayne. Their professional relationship was cordial but distant. Frank did his job, Wayne did his, and their paths rarely crossed outside of premieres and publicity events. The executive lowered his voice. He specifically asked for the security chief who was on duty the night his father's death was announced. "That's you, right?" Frank's blood went cold. Wayne remembered. After nearly 30 years, he remembered that drunken confession in a parking lot. "Yeah," Frank managed. "That's me." The executive studied Frank's face with the calculating gaze of someone whose job was reading people. Whatever he wants to discuss, it stays in the room. Studio business. You understand? Frank understood more than the executive realized. This wasn't about studio business. This was about a secret that had been festering for 3 decades, and someone who decided tonight was the right time to bring it into the light. As the executive returned to the theater, Frank walked to the lobby windows and stared out at Hollywood Boulevard. The red carpet was being rolled up, the crowds were dispersing. But somewhere out there was someone who knew the truth about Clyde Morrison's death, and they were sending messages to John Wayne. Frank checked his watch. 2 hours until the screening ended. 2 hours to figure out if he was about to become part of a secret worth killing for, or if he already had been for 30 years without knowing it. The Duke wanted to talk, and Frank had a feeling neither of them would leave that room the same men who'd entered it. Frank Morrison had 2 hours to kill, and 30 years of memories he'd rather forget. He walked the empty corridors of the Chinese theater like a man patrolling his own past. His footsteps echoed off marble floors that had witnessed every kind of Hollywood drama. Studio heads destroying careers with handshake deals, starlets discovering their names had been quietly removed from credits, agents selling souls by the dozen. Frank had seen it all from the shadows, the invisible man with the badge who cleaned up messes before they became scandals. But some messes never got clean. His reflection caught in the glass of a publicity still. John Wayne astride a white horse, all American righteousness and frontier justice. Frank studied the Duke's face in the photograph, searching for traces of the broken man he'd found in that parking lot 3 decades ago. The Wayne in the picture looked invincible. The Wayne who'd stared at him across the lobby tonight looked like he was drowning. Frank's chest tightened with a familiar ache. He'd spent his entire career protecting other people's secrets, but the one that mattered most wasn't his to protect, it was his to carry, and carrying it was killing him. He thought about Martha, back in their small apartment in Burbank, probably asleep with the television flickering blue light across her face. 32 years of marriage, and he'd never told her about that night in 1949. Never told her about the things he'd heard Wayne confess in his bourbon-soaked grief. She knew Frank had secrets. Any man who'd worked studio security for 15 years collected them like scars, but she'd never pressed. Martha Morrison was a saint that way. Morrison. The shared name with Wayne's father had always felt like more than coincidence. Like fate had assigned Frank to be the keeper of Clyde Morrison's ghost. The theater's air conditioning cycled on, and Frank caught the scent of old cigarettes and decades-old perfume embedded in the velvet seats. This place held secrets in its walls, whispered confessions and backroom deals that had shaped American dreams. Frank had been present for more of them than he cared to remember. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, a habit he'd picked up in Korea and never managed to shake despite Martha's gentle nagging. The smoke tasted like ash and regret. Through the lobby windows, he watched the last of the crowd disperse into the neon-lit night. Ordinary people heading home to ordinary lives, untouched by the weight of terrible knowledge. Frank envied them. He'd been 25 when Wayne stumbled into his life with a secret that would define the next 3 decades. Fresh-faced, ambitious, believing that Hollywood was just another job requiring basic competence and clean hands. The war had taught him to follow orders and keep his mouth shut. Studio security seemed like a logical next step. Good pay, steady work, a chance to see how the dream factory operated from the inside. He'd learned quickly that the factory ran on secrets. Some were harmless, which leading men preferred other leading men, which starlets had drinking problems, which directors cut deals with the mob to finance their pictures. Frank had filed away hundreds of such details, understanding that his job was to know everything and remember nothing. But Wayne's confession had been different. Raw, dangerous, personal. He was murdered, son. Murdered because he found something in that mine he wasn't supposed to find. Frank had carried those words for 30 years, feeling their weight grow heavier with each passing decade. He'd watched Wayne transform from a struggling B-picture cowboy into an American icon, the embodiment of frontier values and righteous violence. The man who'd built his legend on being the hero who always won, who always knew right from wrong, who never backed down from a fight. The man whose father had died screaming in a mine shaft, killed by powerful men who'd erased the truth as efficiently as they'd erased Clyde Morrison. The cigarette burned down to his fingers, and Frank dropped it, grinding the butt under his heel. His reflection in the window looked older than his 53 years, gray at the temples, lines etched deep around his eyes, the weathered face of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. Martha deserved better than a husband who woke up in cold sweats, muttering about mine shafts and murder. She'd married a young veteran with prospects, not a keeper of Hollywood's darkest secrets. Frank thought about the life they could have had if he'd walked away that night in 1949, if he'd reported Wayne's condition to the studio and let someone else handle the aftermath. But he'd stayed. He'd listened. He'd become complicit. Now someone else knew the truth about Clyde Morrison's death, and they were using it as a weapon. The heckler's words hadn't been random. They'd been surgical, precise, designed to cut Wayne where he was most vulnerable. Frank had seen the Duke's reaction, the fear that transformed America's toughest cowboy into a terrified child. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what buttons to push, and that meant they'd been watching, waiting, planning for the right moment to strike. Frank checked his watch again. 1 hour and 47 minutes until Wayne's screening ended. 1 hour and 47 minutes until Frank learned whether the secret he'd carried for 30 years was about to destroy them both. Frank was still staring at his reflection when the payphone rang. The sound cut through the empty lobby like a gunshot. Frank turned, disoriented. The phone booth stood in the corner near the restrooms, its brass fittings gleaming under the dim lights. The ringing continued, sharp, insistent, impossible to ignore. Nobody called the Chinese theater's public phone at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. Frank's feet moved before his mind caught up. Each step echoed in the marble-walled space as the ringing continued its relentless rhythm. His hand hesitated over the receiver. In 30 years of carrying secrets, he'd learned that some phone calls changed everything. He lifted the handset. Frank Morrison. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Silence stretched across the line, filled only with the soft hiss of long-distance static. Then a woman's voice, elderly and careful, spoke with the measured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed these words. "You were there the night he told you about his father." Frank's blood turned to ice water. The receiver felt suddenly heavy in his grip. "Who is this?" "My name is Dorothy Kellerman. I was Clyde Morrison's secretary. And before you hang up, Mr. Morrison, you need to know that I have the documents John Wayne has been looking for his entire life." Frank's knees nearly buckled. He pressed his back against the phone booth's glass wall, his free hand finding purchase on the metal shelf. Clyde Morrison had been dead for 30 years. His secretary should have been dust by now. That's impossible. You'd have to be 91 years old next month. Dorothy Kellerman's voice carried the weight of decades, but underneath lay steel. "I've been waiting a very long time to make this call, Mr. Morrison. Waiting for the right moment. Tonight, someone forced my hand. The heckler." Frank's mind raced, connecting threads he'd never seen before. "You know who sent the message." "I sent it." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He stared through the phone booth's glass at the empty lobby, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. "The man who spoke to Wayne tonight. He's my grandson. I told him what to say." Dorothy's voice carried no apology, only the grim satisfaction of someone who'd waited decades for justice. "I needed Wayne to understand that his father's secret wasn't buried as deeply as the studio believed." Frank struggled to find words. "Why now, after all these years?" "Because I'm dying, Mr. Morrison. Cancer, just like John Wayne had. But unlike the Duke, I don't have time for a comeback." A bitter laugh escaped her. "And because I finally found the one man who might help me finish what Clyde Morrison started. I don't understand." Clyde Morrison wasn't just a mine foreman, Mr. Morrison. He was an investigator. The studio sent him to Winterset to quietly acquire mineral rights for a picture they were planning, a big-budget western that needed authentic locations. But Clyde found something else in those mine records, something that connected half the studio executives in Hollywood to a conspiracy that went all the way back to the oil boom. Frank's cigarette-stained fingers tightened on the receiver. The Chinese theater lobby suddenly felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of buried truths. What kind of conspiracy? The kind that gets men killed and their deaths called accidents. Dorothy's voice hardened. Clyde Morrison discovered that Republic Pictures wasn't just a movie studio, Mr. Morrison. It was a front for the largest land fraud operation in American history. They were using location scouts and advance crews to identify valuable properties, then arranging accidents for anyone who wouldn't sell. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Wayne's drunken rambling about his father finding something he wasn't supposed to find. The specific detail about the mine shaft instead of the working mine. The way Wayne had spent 30 years looking over his shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jesus Christ. Clyde documented everything. Names, dates, financial records. He was going to expose the whole operation. Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. That's why they killed him. That's why they made it look like an accident. And that's why his son has spent 30 years afraid to dig too deep into his father's death. Frank's mind reeled. Where are these documents? Safe. Hidden where they've been for 3 decades, waiting for someone with the courage to use them. The line crackled with static. But Mr. Morrison, you need to understand. The men who killed Clyde Morrison are still alive, still powerful, still dangerous. My grandson's message tonight was just the beginning. They know we're coming for them now. Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 30 years settle on his shoulders like a stone. The secret he'd carried wasn't just about a man's death. It was about a conspiracy that had shaped Hollywood from its foundation. What do you want from me? Meet me tomorrow, noon. The cemetery in Winterset where Clyde Morrison is buried. Dorothy Kellerman's voice carried the finality of a death sentence. Bring John Wayne. It's time he learned the truth about his father's last case. The line went dead. Frank stood frozen in the phone booth, the dead receiver buzzing in his ear like an angry wasp. His reflection stared back from the glass, pale, wide-eyed, looking every bit like a man who'd just been handed his own death warrant. Bring John Wayne. The words echoed in his skull. Dorothy Kellerman might as well have asked him to lasso the moon. You didn't just walk up to John Wayne and invite him to dig up his father's corpse, especially when that corpse came with a 30-year-old conspiracy attached. Frank replaced the receiver with trembling fingers and stepped out of the booth. The lobby felt different now, smaller, more cramped, like the walls were closing in. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every creak of the old building's settling bones sounded like footsteps. He needed air. He needed a drink. He needed to pretend the last 5 minutes had never happened. Instead, he walked to the theater doors and pressed his ear against the wood. The soundtrack swelled inside, gunshots and galloping horses, the familiar rhythm of Wayne dispensing frontier justice. Frank almost laughed at the irony. While America's cowboy hero shot it out with outlaws on screen, the real outlaws had been sitting in studio boardrooms, ordering murders and calling them accidents. His cigarette case was empty. Frank crushed it in his fist, welcoming the sharp edge of metal against his palm. Pain was real. Pain was immediate. Pain didn't require him to choose between impossible options. But even as he told himself to walk away, to forget Dorothy Kellerman and her 91-year-old vendetta, Frank knew he was already lost. Some secrets were too big to carry alone, and this one had been breaking his back for 3 decades. The service corridor door opened behind him. Frank spun, heart hammering, expecting to see studio executives or worse. Instead, a cleaning woman emerged, pushing a cart loaded with supplies. She was small, middle-aged, with the invisible quality of someone who'd spent years working around important people without being seen. Evening, Mr. Morrison. She nodded respectfully. You're here awful late. Carmen. Frank forced his voice to stay level. Just waiting on a meeting. Carmen Martinez had cleaned the Chinese theater for 8 years. Frank had hired her personally after her husband died in a construction accident. One of the genuine accidents that happened in a city where most weren't. She was reliable, discreet, and smart enough to know when not to ask questions. But tonight, she looked nervous. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something?" Carmen glanced around the empty lobby, then stepped closer. Earlier today, some men came by. Said they were from the studio, needed to check the phone lines. But Frank's blood went cold. But what? They didn't look like telephone repair. They looked like... She struggled for the words. Like the kind of men who hurt people. And they were very interested in the payphone. Asked if anyone used it regularly, what kind of calls came in. The walls seemed to press closer. Frank grabbed Carmen's arm, perhaps too tightly, because she winced. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. I don't know nothing about phone calls." Her eyes searched his face. "But Mr. Morrison, I think they were listening. To that call you just took." Frank released her arm, his mind racing. If they'd been monitoring the payphone, they knew about Dorothy Kellerman. They knew about the meeting in Winterset. They knew everything. "Carmen, listen to me very carefully. Tomorrow you call in sick. Don't come to work. Don't come anywhere near this place. But Mr. Morrison, promise me." Frank's voice cracked with desperation. "Whatever you think you saw tonight, whatever you heard, forget it. Your life depends on forgetting it." Carmen's face went ashen. She nodded quickly and hurried away with her cart, wheels squeaking against the marble floor. Frank watched her disappear into the service corridor, another innocent bystander who'd glimpsed the edges of something deadly. He was alone again, but not really alone. Someone was watching. Someone had been watching for years, maybe decades, waiting for Dorothy Kellerman to make her move. The old woman had said her grandson's message was just the beginning. But Frank suspected it was actually the end, the final play in a game that had been rigged from the start. The theater doors opened, spilling light and the sound of swelling orchestral music into the lobby. An usher emerged, spotted Frank, and approached with the careful deference reserved for studio security. "Mr. Morrison? Mr. Wayne's ready to see you now. Conference room B, just down the hall." Frank nodded, his mouth desert dry. In a few minutes he'd be face to face with John Wayne, carrying a secret that could destroy them both. The Duke would want answers Frank couldn't give, solutions Frank couldn't provide. And somewhere in the shadows, powerful men were already moving to silence them both before those answers could see daylight. Frank straightened his tie and walked toward his appointment with the most dangerous conversation of his life. Frank's footsteps echoed down the hallway like gunshots in a tomb. Conference room B sat at the end of the corridor, its frosted glass door glowing with warm light that seemed to mock the darkness closing in around him. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted down by 30 years of silence and the terrible knowledge that silence was about to be shattered forever. The brass doorknob felt ice cold under his palm. Frank paused, listening to the muffled voices inside. Wayne's distinctive drawl, lower than usual, strained. Another voice, studio executive probably, smooth and practiced in the art of making problems disappear. Frank had heard that tone countless times over the years, always preceding the kind of solutions that left bodies buried in unmarked graves. He knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. John Wayne sat hunched over a mahogany conference table, still wearing his tuxedo from the premiere, but with the bow tie undone, hanging loose around his thick neck like a noose. The Duke looked older than his 71 years. The cancer treatments had hollowed his cheeks and dulled the fire in his eyes, but tonight something else had broken inside him. Frank recognized the look. He'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for 3 decades. Across from Wayne sat Harrison Keller, Republic Pictures Vice President of Operations. Keller was 60-something, silver-haired, with the kind of manicured appearance that came from never getting his hands dirty personally. Frank had dealt with men like Keller before, executives who ordered murders from behind polished desks and slept soundly afterward. "Frank," Wayne's voice cracked like old leather. "Sit down. Harry here was just explaining how tonight's incident was probably just some drunk with a grudge." Keller's smile was razor thin. "These things happen at public events, Mr. Morrison. Unstable individuals seeking attention. Nothing more." Frank remained standing, his back against the door. The room felt like a trap, all mahogany walls and no windows. Is that what we're calling it? Frank. Wayne's eyes held a warning. Harry's trying to help. Help. Frank tasted the word like poison. The way the studio helped when your father died? The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Keller's smile vanished, replaced by something predatory and cold. Wayne's face went chalk white. Mr. Morrison, Keller said carefully, I think you're overwrought. Perhaps you should take some time off. Clear your head. My head's plenty clear. Frank stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. Clear enough to remember what John told me in 1949. Clear enough to know that tonight wasn't random. Wayne shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. Frank, don't what? Don't tell the truth? Don't mention that your father was murdered because he found something in those mine records? Something that connected half of Hollywood to the biggest land fraud in American history? Keller went very still. The executive's face remained impassive, but his fingers drummed once against the table, a nervous tell that Frank filed away. Keller knew, had always known. You're talking nonsense, Keller said. Clyde Morrison died in a mining accident. Tragic, but bullshit. Frank's voice cut through the room like a blade. I just got a phone call from Dorothy Kellerman. Remember her, Harry? Clyde's secretary? The one who's been keeping his investigation files for 30 years? Wayne sank back into his chair as if he'd been shot. Keller's drumming fingers went still. Dorothy Kellerman is dead, Keller said quietly. No, she's not. She's 91 and dying of cancer, but she's very much alive. And tomorrow she's going to show us exactly what Clyde Morrison discovered before you people killed him. The room erupted into motion. Keller reached for the phone while Wayne grabbed Frank's arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man battling cancer. Frank, you don't know what you're doing, Wayne hissed. These people, they'll kill us both. They're going to kill us anyway. Frank jerked free, turning to face Keller. How long have you been watching me? How long have you known that John told me the truth? Keller held the phone receiver halfway to his ear, his face a mask of calculation. Long enough to know you should have kept your mouth shut, Morrison. Long enough to arrange appropriate measures. Like the men who were checking phone lines today? The ones listening to my conversation with Dorothy? Wayne's face crumpled with understanding. Jesus, Frank. They know everything. Everything, Keller confirmed, dialing a number with practiced efficiency. Dorothy Kellerman's address, her grandson's identity, the cemetery meeting, all of it. Frank felt the trap closing around them, decades of careful planning reaching its inevitable conclusion. He'd spent 30 years protecting John Wayne's secret, only to discover it was never really secret at all. The studio had been watching, waiting, letting the wound fester until the moment came to cauterize it permanently. There's nowhere to run, Keller said into the phone. Yes, both of them. Tonight. Frank looked at Wayne, America's hero, reduced to a frightened old man facing the same fate as his father, the cycle completing itself with brutal efficiency. I'm sorry, Duke, Frank whispered. I should have told the truth 30 years ago. Wayne met his eyes, and for a moment the old fire flickered back to life. No, son, we should have told it together. The phone rang once in Keller's ear before a voice answered. But instead of speaking immediately, Keller hesitated, his eyes fixed on something behind Frank's shoulder. Harrison. The voice came from the conference room's side door, a door Frank hadn't noticed when he entered. Hang up the phone. Frank spun around, his heart lurching as a familiar figure stepped into the room. The man was tall, lean, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that had seen better decades. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and his eyes held the same steel-blue intensity that had made him a legend in Hollywood boardrooms. John Ford, the director, Wayne's mentor and surrogate father for 40 years. Jack? Wayne's voice broke like a teenager's. What are you doing here? Ford moved with the careful precision of a man in his 80s, but his presence filled the room like smoke. Frank had worked security on Ford's sets for 20 years, had seen the director demolish grown men with a glance, but tonight something felt different. Tonight Ford looked like a man carrying the weight of unforgivable sins. I've been here all evening, Duke, watching, waiting. Ford's gaze swept over Frank, then settled on Wayne with something that might have been regret. Waiting for this conversation to finally happen, Keller still held the phone, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. "Mr. Ford, I don't understand." "Of course you don't." Ford's laugh was bitter as winter wind. 40 years I've been cleaning up messes for men like you, and you never bothered to understand the cost." Frank felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The room's geometry seemed wrong suddenly, as if all his assumptions about who stood where had been built on quicksand. "Jack," Wayne said slowly, "what are you talking about?" Ford reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents. Frank recognized it immediately. The same type of envelope Wayne had pressed into his hands in 1949, trembling and drunk and desperate to confess. "I'm talking about Clyde Morrison, Duke. I'm talking about your father." Ford's voice carried the weight of decades. "And I'm talking about the lie I've been helping you live for 30 years. The air left Frank's lungs in a rush. Wayne stared at Ford as if seeing a stranger wearing his mentor's face. "That's impossible," Wayne whispered. "Is it?" Ford opened the envelope and scattered photographs across the conference table. Black and white images of men in suits standing around mining equipment. Frank recognized some of the faces from Republic Pictures' executive roster, circa 1937. "These were taken 3 days before your father died, Duke. I know because I was there." Frank grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. In the photographs, standing next to Republic executives and pointing at mining diagrams, was a younger John Ford, unmistakable despite 30 years of aging. "I was the advance man," Ford continued, his voice hollow. "Location scout for the western we were planning to shoot in Iowa. That's how I met Clyde Morrison. He was supposed to be our local contact, help us secure the mining rights for filming." Wayne's face had gone gray as old concrete. "No. Your father was a good man, Duke. Honest. When he discovered what we were really doing, the fraud, the murders disguised as accidents, he tried to stop it, tried to expose us." Ford's hands shook as he gathered the photographs. "I begged him to walk away. Told him some secrets were too big for one man to carry." Frank understood before Wayne did. The terrible truth hit him like a physical blow, making him stagger backward until he hit the wall. "You killed him," Frank breathed. "No." Ford's voice cracked. "But I didn't stop them. I stood there and watched while they sealed that mine shaft with Clyde Morrison inside, watched while they called it an accident, watched while they destroyed the investigation files." Wayne rose from his chair like a man sleepwalking through his own funeral. "Jack, why?" "Because they owned me, Duke. Because I was weak and scared and 20 years younger than I should have been." Ford's legendary composure finally shattered. "And because they promised me something in return for my silence." The room held its breath. "They promised me you," Ford whispered. "A broken kid from Iowa who'd never know his father died a hero. A kid I could mold into the greatest star Hollywood ever produced. They gave me John Wayne in exchange for Clyde Morrison's life." Frank watched Wayne's world collapse in real time. The Duke's legs buckled, and he fell back into his chair as if he'd been shot through the heart. "Every picture we made," Wayne said numbly. "Every role, every scene, built on your father's grave." Ford looked ancient suddenly, a hollow shell wearing a director's clothes. "I created America's greatest cowboy to hide the murder of one honest man, and I convinced myself it was worth it." Keller had gone silent, the phone forgotten in his hand. Frank realized the executive was as shocked as anyone. Ford's confession had just rewritten 30 years of carefully constructed lies. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, finally understanding the scope of his own blindness. "You've been protecting him from the truth all these years. Not from them, from you." Ford's admission hung in the air like gunpowder smoke after a fatal shot. Frank watched Wayne crumble inward, the Duke's massive frame folding as if his bones had turned to dust. 30 years of hero worship, of surrogate father-son devotion, reduced to ash in a single confession. "Every lesson you taught me," Wayne's voice was barely audible, "every piece of advice about being a man, about doing what's right, was me trying to turn you into the man your real father already was." Ford's eyes were wet now, tears cutting tracks down his weathered cheeks. Clyde Morrison had more integrity in his little finger than I've had in my entire career. Keller slowly replaced the phone receiver, his executive composure finally cracking. Mr. Ford, the studio had no idea you were involved in the original situation. Of course you didn't. Ford's laugh was bitter as alkali water. You people never bothered to ask where John Wayne came from. You just cashed the checks and built the myth. But I knew. Every day for 40 years I've carried that dead man's son on my shoulders. Frank felt sick. The room spun around him as pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The fan tonight. The joke about Wayne's father. That wasn't random harassment. Dorothy Kellerman's grandson. Ford nodded heavily. She's been waiting decades for the right moment, the right audience. What better stage than a premiere, with cameras rolling and reporters watching? Make sure John's reaction would be preserved forever. Wayne looked up sharply, some of his old fire flickering back to life. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to hurt him. Ford gestured toward himself. You were just the weapon she chose. Dorothy spent 30 years watching me build your career, knowing every accolade, every honor, every moment of public adoration was purchased with her boss's blood. The conference room felt like a tomb now, airless and final. Frank realized they were all corpses here. Wayne destroyed by the truth about his mentor, Ford consumed by decades of guilt, and himself trapped in the middle of a collision he'd spent 30 years trying to prevent. The envelope, Frank said suddenly. The one Wayne gave me in 1949. What was really in it? Ford's shoulders sagged further. Insurance, documentation of my involvement, my guilt. John found my personal files after a bender in '48, figured out I wasn't the man he thought I was. That envelope was his way of making sure someone else knew the truth, even if he couldn't face it himself. Wayne's hands shook as he reached for his cigarettes, the pack nearly empty. I remember that night. You came to me afterward, told me I was drunk imagining things, said the envelope was just old contracts. I've spent more energy protecting you from that truth than I ever spent making pictures. Ford turned to face Wayne directly, and Frank saw the moment as what it was, a deathbed confession 40 years in the making. But Dorothy Kellerman won't wait any longer. She's dying, and she wants justice before she goes. What does she have? Keller asked, his voice tight with fear. What kind of evidence? Ford reached into his jacket again, withdrawing a second envelope, this one sealed with wax that looked decades old. Clyde Morrison wasn't just investigating the mining fraud, he was documenting it. Pictures, signed confessions from workers, copies of forged documents, everything. The room went dead silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Dorothy kept it all, Ford continued, waited for the right moment to use it. Tonight was just the opening move. Tomorrow, when she meets with Frank and Winterset, she'll hand over enough evidence to destroy half of Hollywood. Frank felt the walls closing in. And you've known this whole time? I've been preparing for this day since 1937. Ford's voice carried the weight of a man who'd lived too long with unbearable knowledge. Every decision I made, every picture we shot, every moment of your career, Duke, it was all borrowed time. I knew eventually the bill would come due. Wayne stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, Frank thought the Duke might take a swing at Ford, 40 years of betrayal and manipulation boiling over into violence. Instead, Wayne walked to the window and stared out at the Hollywood hills, his back rigid with something between rage and despair. What happens now? Wayne asked without turning around. Now we stop running from the truth. Ford's voice carried a strange note of relief, as if laying down a burden he'd carried too long. Now we face what we should have faced decades ago. Keller was already reaching for the phone again. The studio won't allow... The studio, Ford said quietly, is about to discover that some secrets are too big even for Hollywood to bury. Frank realized this was the point of no return. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the careful lies and managed silences that had defined their lives. The truth was coming, whether they were ready or not. Wayne turned from the window, his face transformed. The confusion and hurt had crystallized into something Frank had seen in a dozen westerns but never in real life. Pure, cold determination. No, Wayne said quietly. I'm done running. Ford blinked in surprise. Duke, you don't understand what you're saying. I understand perfectly. Wayne's voice carried the authority that had commanded movie sets for 3 decades. You've spent 40 years making my choices for me, Jack. Deciding what I could handle, what I needed to know. Well, I'm 51 years old, and I'm making my own choices now. Frank watched Wayne cross the room to where Keller sat frozen, the executive's hand still hovering over the telephone. With deliberate precision, Wayne reached down and disconnected the phone line from the wall. No more calls, Wayne said. No more studio handlers. No more lies. Keller shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. Mr. Wayne, you're under contract. The studio has invested millions in your image. Built on my father's corpse. Wayne's words cut like a blade. Every dollar you've made off the Duke came from Clyde Morrison's blood. Well, the bank's closed, Harry. Ford stepped forward, his legendary composure cracking completely. Duke, please, think about what you're doing. Your career, your legacy. My legacy? Wayne laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean the lie you've been selling for 30 years? The great American hero who never knew his daddy was murdered by the same people who made him famous? Frank felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. Wayne was taking control, and it was beautiful and terrible to witness. This was what Ford had tried to protect him from, not the truth about his father's death, but the devastating knowledge of his own manufactured heroism. I've been wondering my whole adult life why nothing felt real, Wayne continued. Why every role felt like playing dress-up, why I could never quite believe in John Wayne the way audiences did. Now I know. Because John Wayne was built to hide a murder. Keller backed toward the door, finally understanding that his carefully managed world was dissolving. The studio won't permit this kind of publicity nightmare. Wayne moved faster than Frank had seen him move in years, stepping between Keller and the exit. Despite the cancer eating at his strength, Wayne still cut an imposing figure when he chose to. The studio permitted my father's murder, Wayne said softly. They don't get a vote anymore. Ford sank into a chair, looking every one of his 80 years. What are you going to do? Wayne turned to Frank, and in his eyes Frank saw something he'd never seen before. Absolute clarity. We're going to Iowa, Wayne said. Frank and me. We're going to meet Dorothy Kellerman, and we're going to hear what my father died trying to expose. Frank's heart pounded against his ribs. Duke, are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. I know. Wayne's smile was grim but genuine. Good. I'm tired of living in reverse. Ford rose unsteadily to his feet. They'll destroy you, both of you. The studio has resources, connections. They can make you disappear just like they made Clyde Morrison disappear? Wayne finished. Let them try. But this time there'll be witnesses. This time the truth gets told. Keller made one last desperate play. Think about your fans, John. Think about what this will do to America. You're a symbol, an ideal. I'm a lie. Wayne's voice was steady now, resolved. And lies don't make good foundations for anything worth keeping. Frank realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. The death of John Wayne and the birth of Marion Morrison. The man who'd been buried under 30 years of studio mythology was clawing his way back to the surface. Frank, Wayne said, turning to face him completely, I'm asking you to come with me, not as my security chief, not as a studio employee. As a friend helping another friend find out how his father really died. Frank looked around the room, at Ford collapsed in guilt, at Keller calculating damage control, at the scattered photographs of conspirators long dead. Then he looked at Wayne, standing straighter than he had in months despite carrying cancer in his bones. When do we leave? Frank asked. Wayne's smile transformed his face, erasing years of carefully maintained facades. Tonight, before they can stop us. Ford made a sound like a wounded animal. Duke, please. 40 years we've worked together. 40 years you've been trying to turn me into my father, Wayne corrected. Maybe it's time I tried it myself. Frank felt the weight of 30 years lifting from his shoulders as he moved toward the door. The truth was finally coming home, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't afraid of it. The flight to Iowa was quiet as a funeral procession. Frank sat beside Wayne in first class, watching the Duke stare out at the darkness below. Somewhere over Colorado, Wayne finally spoke. You know what the strangest part is, Frank? I feel like I can breathe for the first time in 30 years. They landed in Des Moines at dawn, the sky the color of old pewter. Dorothy Kellerman was waiting in the terminal, a tiny woman in her 70s, her back straight as a rifle barrel despite her age, her eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter, fixed on Wayne with an expression Frank couldn't read. "Mr. Morrison," she said, deliberately using his birth name. "Thank you for coming." Wayne removed his hat, the gesture unconsciously reverent. "Ma'am, I understand you knew my father." "I worked for him, respected him, loved him like a brother." Her voice carried the flat honesty of the prairie. "He was a good man who died for trying to do right." She led them to her car, a weathered Buick that had seen better decades. As they drove through the Iowa countryside, she told them about Clyde Morrison, not the absent father of Hollywood legend, but a man who'd stood up to corruption when it would have been easier to look away. "Your daddy found the bodies first," she said, her eyes on the empty road. 3 miners who'd gotten too close to the truth about the fraudulent claims. They were buried in cave-ins that weren't accidents. Wayne's hands clenched in his lap, and he tried to stop it. Tried to expose it. Had photographs, documents, testimonies. He was going to the federal authorities. Her laugh was bitter. He thought the law still meant something back then. They stopped at a small farmhouse outside Winterset, its white paint faded, but still proud against the endless sky. Inside, Dorothy had prepared a shrine to Clyde Morrison. Photographs, documents, the evidence of a life cut short by men who valued profit over human decency. "This is everything your father died for," she said, handing Wayne a thick folder. "Every piece of evidence he gathered, every proof of what they did to those miners." Frank watched Wayne's face as he read, seeing the Duke's carefully constructed world crumble and reform with each page. These weren't the documents of a drifter or a drunk. They were the meticulous records of a man fighting for justice. He was going to be somebody, Wayne said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Really somebody. "He already was somebody," Dorothy corrected gently. "He was your father. That was enough." They buried the evidence that afternoon. Not literally, but publicly. Wayne called a press conference from the farmhouse, Dorothy beside him, Frank standing guard at the door. The Duke told the truth simply, without Hollywood dramatics, his voice steady as prairie wind. The story broke like a thunderclap across America. The studio tried damage control, but it was too late. The myth of John Wayne had been voluntarily destroyed by the man himself. Ford tried to reach them by telephone, but Wayne wouldn't take the call. "Some bridges," Wayne told Frank, "need to burn." They stayed in Iowa for a week, visiting Clyde Morrison's grave, meeting with federal investigators who promised to reopen the cases. Wayne seemed to grow younger each day, as if shedding the weight of manufactured heroism had restored something essential to his spirit. On their last evening, they sat on Dorothy's porch watching the sun set over the cornfields. Wayne looked like a man who'd found his way home after decades of wandering. "You know what I realized today?" Wayne said quietly. "I spent my whole career trying to be worthy of John Wayne. But John Wayne was never real. My father, he was real. And maybe that's enough." Dorothy nodded from her rocking chair. "He'd be proud of you, Marion. Not for the movies or the fame, for choosing truth over comfort." Frank felt tears on his cheeks, though he couldn't say exactly why. Maybe for Clyde Morrison, dead 30 years but finally vindicated. Maybe for Wayne, free at last from the prison of his own legend. Maybe for himself, no longer carrying secrets that weren't his to bear. The flight back to California was different, lighter somehow. Wayne slept most of the way, his face peaceful in a way Frank had never seen. The Duke was gone, but Marion Morrison had returned, and that felt like a kind of resurrection. At LAX, reporters waited like vultures. Wayne faced them calmly, answering questions with the same quiet honesty he'd shown in Iowa. Yes, his career might be over. No, he didn't regret it. His father had died for the truth, and 30 years later the truth had finally won. Frank drove Wayne home through the Hollywood Hills, past the studio gates where they'd both worked for decades. The town looked different now, smaller, less impressive, like a movie set viewed from behind. "What will you do now?" Frank asked as they pulled into Wayne's driveway. Wayne smiled, and Frank realized it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from the man in all their years together. "Live honestly." Wayne said simply. Seems like the least I can do for my father. That night, Frank returned to his trailer and burned the envelope Wayne had given him 30 years ago. The secret was finally free, and so was he. Outside his window, the Pacific rolled endlessly against the shore, washing the world clean under starlight that had witnessed everything and forgiven it all.